There is a story, told for centuries, of a man sitting quietly in a garden when an apple fell from a tree above him. And in that single ordinary moment, he supposedly understood the force that holds the entire universe together. It is one of the most famous stories in the history of science. It is also, in the way most people imagine it, almost certainly not true. And yet the real story behind that falling apple is stranger, slower, and far more revealing than the myth. It begins not with a flash of genius, but with a sickly, premature infant who was not expected to survive his first night alive, born into a small stone farmhouse in the English countryside, fatherless before he ever drew breath. That infant would grow into a man so guarded, so obsessive, and so relentlessly curious that he would eventually rewrite humanity's understanding of light, motion, and the heavens themselves. His name was Isaac Newton, and to understand how he became one of the most consequential minds in history, we have to go back to a world that still believed the stars were fixed to crystal spheres, and that nature's deepest secrets belonged to God alone. To understand Newton, it helps to first understand the world he was born into, because it was a world in the middle of an argument with itself about what could be known and how. In the early 17th century, most educated Europeans still pictured the universe largely as the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle and the medieval church had described it. The Earth sat motionless at the center of everything, and the sun, moon, planets, and stars circled around it, embedded in perfect, unchanging crystalline spheres. Change, decay, and imperfection belonged only to the world below the moon. Above it, the heavens were thought to be eternal and flawless. This picture was comforting. It placed humanity at the literal center of creation, and it fit neatly with religious teaching. But cracks had already begun to appear in that picture. A century earlier, the Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus had proposed something radical and, to many, deeply unsettling: that the Earth was not the center of the universe at all, but simply one planet among several, all orbiting the sun. Decades later, the German astronomer Johannes Kepler took Copernicus's idea further, showing through painstaking calculation that the planets did not move in perfect circles, as everyone had assumed, but in ellipses, and that their speeds changed depending on how close they were to the sun. And in Italy, Galileo Galilei had turned a new invention, the telescope, toward the sky, and found mountains on the moon, spots on the sun, and moons orbiting Jupiter, none of which belonged to the tidy, unchanging heavens that people had been taught to believe in. For his trouble, Galileo was placed under house arrest by the Catholic Church for the rest of his life, a reminder of just how dangerous these new ideas could be to the authorities of the time. England, where Newton would be born, was itself a nation in turmoil. It was a country racked by religious division between Protestants and Catholics, and increasingly by political conflict between a king who believed he ruled by divine right and a parliament that believed otherwise. Within a few short years of Newton's birth, that conflict would explode into a civil war that would end with the execution of a king. It was, in short, a world where the old certainties, both political and cosmic, were beginning to crack apart, and nobody yet knew what would replace them. Science, as we would recognize it today, barely existed as an organized discipline. There was no agreed method for testing ideas about nature. Much of what passed for natural philosophy, as science was then called, mixed careful observation with speculation, ancient authority, and outright superstition. Alchemy, the pursuit of transforming base metals into gold and discovering the secrets of life itself, was practiced seriously by learned men, not dismissed as pseudoscience. Astrology was still widely respected as a legitimate way of understanding the influence of the heavens on human affairs. Mathematics existed, but the tools needed to describe motion, change, and force with real precision had not yet been invented. It was into this uncertain, transitional world, a world still deciding what knowledge even was, that a fragile infant was born on Christmas Day, by the Old English calendar, in the winter of 1642. The place was Woolsthorpe Manor, a modest stone farmhouse in Lincolnshire, in the flat agricultural heart of England, surrounded by fields and orchards. It was not a grand estate. The Newton family were yeoman farmers, prosperous enough by local standards, but far from wealthy or noble. The house itself still stands today, a low, sturdy building of local limestone, and it would later become, almost by accident, one of the most important sites in the history of science. The child born there that winter was named Isaac after his father. But his father, also named Isaac Newton, had died 3 months before his son was born, leaving behind a widow, a farm, and a name for a son he would never meet. The infant who arrived that Christmas was so small and so weak that, according to family stories passed down for generations, 2 women sent to fetch supplies for the newborn stopped along the road because they believed there was no urgency. They did not expect the child to live long enough to need anything at all. Newton himself later remarked, as an old man, that he had been born so prematurely and so small that he could reportedly have fit inside a quart pot, a container little bigger than a large mug. Whether that detail is precisely accurate or a piece of family folklore polished over decades, the underlying truth is clear enough. The boy who would eventually map the workings of the heavens began his life as an infant not expected to survive it. His mother, Hannah Asco Newton, came from a somewhat more genteel family than her late husband, and she now found herself a young widow responsible for a farm, a household, and a fragile newborn son, all without the husband who was supposed to have shared that burden. For the first few years of his life, it was Hannah who raised him, in that same stone farmhouse, largely alone. Then, when Isaac was about 3 years old, his mother remarried. Her new husband was a wealthy, elderly clergyman named Barnabas Smith, the rector of a nearby parish. It was, in the practical terms of the 17th century, a sensible match. Smith was financially secure, and marrying him gave Hannah and her son a measure of security they might not otherwise have had. But there was a condition attached to this new arrangement, one that would leave a lasting mark on young Isaac. Barnabas Smith did not want another man's child in his household, and so Hannah moved to her new husband's rectory, a mile or so away, while Isaac, not yet 4 years old, was left behind at Woolsthorpe to be raised by his grandmother, Marjorie Asco. It is difficult to know precisely what a child that young understood about why his mother had left or how he processed the sudden separation. But we do have hints, later in life, of how deeply this abandonment, if we can call it that, affected him. Decades afterward, as a grown man, Newton compiled a private list of sins he believed he had committed before the age of 19, a document evidently written as part of some religious self-examination. Among the confessions on that list is a chilling entry, a memory of threatening, as a boy, to burn his mother and stepfather, along with the house they lived in, over their heads. Whatever the precise circumstances behind that memory, it tells us something important. The little boy left behind at Woolsthorpe carried real anger about what had happened to him, anger significant enough that he still remembered it, and apparently still felt the weight of it, well into adulthood. We should be careful here. We are not psychologists trying to diagnose a man who died nearly 3 centuries ago, and Newton's later personality, brilliant, guarded, and prone to intense private grudges, cannot be reduced to a single childhood event. But the historical evidence does suggest a boy who grew up feeling, in some fundamental way, unwanted and alone, raised not by his parents but by a grandmother, in a household his mother had left. Whatever role this played in shaping him, it is worth remembering as we watch this same boy grow into a man who would spend enormous stretches of his life working entirely alone, trusting almost no one, and reacting with startling intensity to anyone he felt had wronged him. This arrangement lasted roughly 8 years. Barnabas Smith died in 1653 when Isaac was about 10, and Hannah returned to Woolsthorpe, bringing with her 3 young children from her second marriage, a half-brother and 2 half-sisters that Isaac had barely known. The family was together again under one roof, but Isaac was now the eldest of 4 children in a house that, for most of his conscious memory, had not included his mother at all. Whatever reunion took place, it does not appear to have fully repaired whatever had been broken. Newton's relationship with his mother would remain, for the rest of her life, respectful on the surface but never especially warm. Not long after Hannah's return, Isaac was sent away again, this time not for family reasons, but for his education. At around the age of 12, he was enrolled at the King's School in the market town of Grantham, several miles from Woolsthorpe, too far to travel each day. He would board in town during the school term, lodging with a local apothecary, a druggist and chemist named William Clark, and his family. At King's School, Isaac was taught the standard curriculum of the era for boys destined for university: Latin, some Greek, arithmetic, and religious instruction. By most surviving accounts, he was not, at first, an especially remarkable student. He seems to have been more interested in things than in books, more drawn to building than to reciting. Contemporary and later biographical accounts describe him as somewhat withdrawn, more comfortable in his own company than among the other boys, and inclined to spend his free time constructing small mechanical devices rather than playing the games that occupied his classmates. There is a well-known story, recorded by early biographers who spoke to people who had known Newton or heard accounts passed down from those who had, that his academic turning point came after a physical fight with another boy at the school. According to this account, Isaac had been ranked low in his class, and after this schoolyard confrontation, in which he apparently got the better of a boy who had kicked him, Isaac resolved not only to beat the boy physically, but to surpass him academically as well. Whether the details of this story are precisely accurate, historians can't say with certainty, since it comes to us secondhand, filtered through decades of retelling. But what is well documented is the outcome. Young Isaac's academic performance improved dramatically during his time at Grantham, and he rose to become the top student in his school. More revealing than his grades, though, was what Isaac did with his hands and his imagination outside the classroom. Lodging above an apothecary's shop meant he was surrounded, quite literally, by the tools and substances of early chemistry: powders, mixtures, scales, and instruments used to measure and combine ingredients. It is not hard to imagine how this environment might have nurtured his growing fascination with how things worked. He filled the margins of his schoolbooks with drawings of birds, of ships, of geometric figures, of men and animals, sketches that survive today and show a boy paying close, careful attention to the shapes of the world around him. He also became known, among the other boys and the townspeople of Grantham, for building things. He constructed small working models, a miniature windmill, built after watching workmen construct a real one nearby, complete, according to some accounts, with a tiny mouse inside functioning as the miller that Newton reportedly rigged up to move the mechanism, as though the mouse itself were operating the mill. He built kites and experimented with attaching small lanterns to them so that, flown at night, they apparently startled and frightened nearby villagers, who mistook the lights drifting through the darkness for something more ominous. He constructed a small wooden water clock, using dripping water to measure time, and reportedly kept it running well enough that household members relied on it. He built sundials, carefully marking the hours by observing the movement of shadows, and later biographers note that he became so attuned to the sun's daily path that he could apparently tell the time of day fairly accurately just by the length and position of a shadow, without needing any instrument at all. None of this made him popular in the ordinary sense. He seems to have preferred the company of girls to boys during these years, according to some biographical accounts, finding conversation with them gentler than the roughhousing of his male classmates. And there is a persisting story, impossible to verify with certainty but widely repeated, of a mild childhood attachment to a girl named Miss Storer, the stepdaughter of the apothecary he lodged with. What is clear, beyond the uncertain romantic details, is a consistent pattern. This was a boy who observed the world with unusual patience, who preferred building and tinkering to play, and who was already, in his early teenage years, developing the habits of careful, solitary attention that would define his entire adult life. Then, when Isaac was about 17, his formal education was abruptly interrupted. His mother, now a widow for the second time and managing the family farm at Woolsthorpe, decided it was time for her eldest son to come home and take up the practical business of running the estate. Isaac was pulled out of King's School and brought back to Woolsthorpe to learn farming, to manage livestock, to oversee crops, and to essentially step into the role his father would have filled had he lived. It did not go well. By nearly every surviving account, Isaac was a spectacularly poor farmer, not because he lacked ability, but because his attention simply was not there. Sent to market in the nearby town of Grantham to sell produce or conduct business, he would instead find some quiet corner, often at the very apothecary's house where he had once lodged, and lose himself in books or mathematical problems while a servant handled the actual transactions. Sent to watch over animals in the field, he was reportedly found instead absorbed in a book or sketching a water wheel, while the animals wandered off into a neighbor's crops. occasionally resulting in fines for trespass that the family had to pay. His mother, understandably frustrated, seems to have found her son's behavior baffling and impractical. Fortunately for the future of science, someone intervened. Isaac's uncle, William Asko, a clergyman who had himself attended Cambridge University, appears to have recognized that his nephew's talents were being wasted on a farm. So too did Henry Stokes, the schoolmaster at King's School in Grantham, who had presumably watched Isaac's transformation from a mediocre student into the top of his class, and who reportedly pleaded with Hannah to allow the boy to return to his studies and prepare for university, rather than remain tied to farm work he was so evidently unsuited for. Between the schoolmaster's advocacy and the uncle's connections, Hannah was eventually persuaded. Isaac was sent back to King's School for a final stretch of preparation, and then, in the summer of 1661, at the age of 18, he was admitted to Trinity College at the University of Cambridge. It is worth pausing here to consider how differently history might have unfolded had Hannah Newton not relented, had the schoolmaster not intervened, had the uncle not used his influence. The boy who built windmills with mice inside them and lost track of grazing cattle while reading might easily have spent his entire life as a farmer in Lincolnshire, his name never recorded anywhere beyond a parish register. Instead, he was about to enter one of the great universities of Europe at a moment in history when the questions being asked there were about to change forever. Cambridge in the early 1660s was not the modern research university we might imagine today. Its curriculum was still built largely around the philosophy of Aristotle, taught much as it had been taught for centuries: logic, ethics, and a physics of nature that had barely changed since antiquity. Students were expected to attend lectures, participate in formal disputations, and demonstrate mastery of established texts rather than pursue new discoveries. Newton, admitted as what was called a subsizar, a student of relatively modest means who performed certain duties or received reduced fees in exchange for his place, was not among the wealthier students at Trinity. He arrived with practical household items his mother provided, and with a modest allowance, and he began his studies in the officially prescribed manner, working through the traditional Aristotelian curriculum. But something remarkable happened fairly quickly. Newton began, on his own initiative, to read well beyond what his tutors assigned. He acquired a notebook, still preserved today and known to historians as his early philosophical notebook, in which he began recording notes not on Aristotle, but on an entirely different and much newer set of thinkers. He read, and took extensive notes on, the mechanical philosophy of René Descartes, the French philosopher and mathematician who had proposed that the physical universe operated like an enormous machine, governed by matter and motion, rather than by the mystical qualities and purposes that Aristotelian philosophy assumed. He encountered the work of Galileo, whose observations and mathematical descriptions of falling bodies and motion challenged the old physics directly. He read about the atomistic ideas of ancient philosophers, revived by contemporary thinkers, suggesting that matter was made of tiny indivisible particles rather than the four classical elements. He absorbed the astronomical framework built by Copernicus and refined by Kepler, in which the Earth was a planet like any other, circling the Sun in an elliptical path. In the margin of this notebook, Newton wrote a short Latin phrase that has since become one of the most quoted lines in the history of science: Amicus Plato, amicus Aristoteles, magis amica veritas. Plato is my friend, Aristotle is my friend, but truth is a greater friend still. It was, in effect, a personal declaration of intellectual independence from a 19 or 20-year-old student, a statement that he would follow evidence and reasoning wherever it led, even against the authority of the ancient philosophers. His university was still built around teaching. This was the beginning of a pattern that would define Newton's entire intellectual life, an almost complete indifference to simply absorbing what he was told, paired with an intense, self-directed drive to work through problems on his own, from first principles, often going far beyond anything his teachers expected or even understood. He was not rebelling loudly or publicly. By all accounts, he remained a quiet, largely solitary figure at Trinity, attending required lectures and disputations as necessary, but reserving his real intellectual energy for private study, often late into the night, alone in his room. Mathematics, in particular, seized his attention with unusual force. He began teaching himself geometry, working through the classical texts of Euclid, and then moved rapidly into far more advanced territory, studying the analytic geometry of Descartes and the algebra of contemporary English mathematicians like John Wallis, who held the position of Savilian Professor of Geometry at Oxford and whose work on infinite series and the mathematics of curves Newton studied closely. What is striking, looking back at Newton's notebooks from this period, is the speed and independence of his progress. Within roughly 2 years of arriving at Cambridge as a student without any particularly advanced mathematical background, he had worked his way to the frontier of what was mathematically known in Europe and had begun to see, dimly at first, problems that no existing mathematics could fully solve. One of Newton's tutors at Cambridge, a mathematician named Isaac Barrow who held the position of Lucasian Professor of Mathematics, appears to have recognized something unusual in this quiet student, though the full extent of their relationship and how directly Barrow mentored Newton remains somewhat debated among historians. What is clear is that Newton was operating largely as an autodidact, teaching himself through intense, self-guided study, filling notebook after notebook with mathematical investigations, observations, and questions that went well beyond anything a formal Cambridge education of the period was designed to produce. Newton was elected a Scholar of Trinity College in 1664, a position that provided him financial support and set him on a path toward an eventual academic career, and he was on track to complete his undergraduate degree the following year. But in 1665, something happened that would disrupt not only Newton's studies, but the ordinary functioning of the entire university, and indeed much of England. The plague had returned. Bubonic plague was not a new horror in 17th century Europe. It had struck repeatedly for centuries. But the outbreak that began spreading through London in the spring and summer of 1665 grew into one of the worst epidemics England had experienced in decades, eventually killing tens of thousands of people in London alone before it subsided. As the disease spread and death tolls mounted, terrified of contagion, the authorities at Cambridge made the decision to close the university and send the students home, hoping to limit the spread of infection through the crowded colleges. For most students, this would have simply meant an interrupted education and an anxious wait for normal life to resume. For Newton, still in his early 20s, it meant something else entirely, an extended, largely uninterrupted stretch of time, away from the structure and social demands of college life, alone at Woolsthorpe Manor, free to pursue whatever problems his mind fixed upon, without any tutor's curriculum to follow and no fellow students to distract him. What followed, across roughly 2 years, split between 1665 and 1666, with brief returns to Cambridge in between as conditions allowed, has become one of the most celebrated periods in the history of science, sometimes referred to, using a Latin phrase, as Newton's Annus Mirabilis, his year or years of wonders. It is a period surrounded by a great deal of popular myth, and it is worth being honest and careful about what we actually know, because the truth, while less tidy than the legend, is in some ways even more impressive. The popular story holds that Newton, isolated at Woolsthorpe by the plague, suddenly and almost magically invented calculus, discovered the nature of light and color, and worked out the theory of universal gravitation, all within a year or two of quiet countryside solitude, essentially inventing modern physics from scratch while sitting under an apple tree. The reality, as historians who have studied Newton's actual notebooks and manuscripts from this period have shown, is considerably more complicated and more human. Newton did make extraordinary progress during this period on several fronts at once. But much of that progress was the continuation of mathematical and experimental work he had already begun at Cambridge before the plague forced his departure, and much of it would take years, in some cases decades, of further refinement before it reached the polished, complete form for which Newton is remembered. The plague years were not the sudden birth of Newton's greatest ideas out of nowhere. They were an unusually fertile, uninterrupted stretch in which seeds already planted grew with remarkable speed, because for once, nothing else was competing for his attention. Still, calling this period remarkable is not an exaggeration, even with the myths set aside. During these months at Woolsthorpe, working largely alone with books, notebooks, prisms, and whatever instruments he could gather or construct himself, Newton made substantial progress in at least 3 major areas that would each, eventually, transform an entire branch of science. The first was mathematics. Newton had already begun, before leaving Cambridge, wrestling with problems involving curves, rates of change, and infinite series, problems that existing mathematical tools of the period could not handle with real precision. Questions like, how do you calculate the exact speed of an object at a single instant, when speed is normally defined as distance traveled over a stretch of time? How do you find the exact area under a curved line, when the tools of geometry were built primarily for straight edges and simple shapes? These were not abstract puzzles for their own sake. They were exactly the kinds of questions that needed answering if anyone hoped to give a precise mathematical description of motion, whether the motion of a falling stone or the motion of a planet sweeping through the sky. During his time at Woolsthorpe, Newton developed and refined a general method for handling exactly these kinds of problems, a system he referred to as the method of flux science. In essence, and without needing to dive into the technical machinery of it, Newton had found a way to treat quantities not as fixed, static amounts, but as things that flow and change continuously over time, and to calculate precisely how fast they were changing or how much had accumulated at any given instant. This was, in substance, the mathematics that the world would later come to know as calculus, one of the most powerful mathematical tools ever developed, and one that remains absolutely fundamental to physics, engineering, and countless other fields to this day. It is worth noting, since the story becomes important later, that Newton did not publish this work at the time. He worked it out largely for his own use, recorded it in private manuscripts, and would not make it widely available to other mathematicians for many years, a decision that would eventually entangle him in one of the bitterest disputes of his life. The second major area of progress during this period concerned motion and the beginnings of Newton's thinking about what would eventually become his theory of gravitation. Newton began working through questions about how objects move when forces act upon them, exploring, in his notebooks, ideas about inertia, the tendency of a moving object to keep moving unless something interferes with it, ideas that built upon, and significantly extended, work that Galileo had begun decades earlier. He also began turning his attention specifically to circular motion, calculating, with real mathematical rigor for the first time, the force required to keep an object moving in a circular path rather than flying off in a straight line. This may sound like a narrow technical problem, but it was, in fact, a crucial piece of a much larger puzzle Newton would spend years assembling. The question of what force keeps the moon circling the Earth rather than drifting away into space. The third area, and in some ways the most immediately dramatic, involved light itself. And it is worth telling this story properly, because it remains one of the most elegant and satisfying experimental investigations in the history of science. In the 17th century, the prevailing assumption, inherited largely from Aristotle and rarely seriously questioned, was that white light, ordinary daylight, was pure and simple, a single, uniform kind of light, and that colors were something added to it, or produced by some kind of modification or corruption of that pure whiteness. When light passed through a colored glass, or through a prism, and colors appeared, the assumption was that the glass or the prism itself was somehow generating those colors, altering the light in the process of passing through it. Newton, during this period, acquired a glass prism, likely purchased at a fair in Cambridge, initially, by his own account, out of curiosity, as something of a novelty item people used to entertain themselves by creating colored patterns. But Newton did not treat it as a toy. He set up a careful, deliberate experiment. He darkened a room completely, blocking out all light except for a single small hole cut into a window shutter, allowing just one narrow beam of sunlight to enter the otherwise dark space. He placed his prism in the path of that narrow beam, and on the far wall, where the light landed after passing through the glass, he observed the beam spread out into an elongated band of colors, arranged in a consistent order: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet, blending smoothly into one another. This band of colors, produced when light was broken apart by the prism, is what we now call a spectrum, and it was not itself an unfamiliar sight. Prisms had been used to produce such displays before. What Newton did next was what mattered. If the prevailing assumption was correct, that the prism was somehow adding color to originally pure white light, then passing that already colored light through a second prism should, presumably, add even more color, or further alter and complicate the pattern. Newton tested this directly. He isolated a single color from the spectrum, allowing just one narrow band, say, the red portion, to pass through a small hole, blocking out all the other colors, and then directed that isolated colored light through a second prism. If the color were being freshly generated by the glass, this second prism should have changed it further, perhaps splitting the red light into some other combination of colors. It did not. The isolated red light passed through the second prism and emerged still simply red, bent at a different angle, but fundamentally unchanged in color. Newton then went a step further, and this is the part of the experiment often considered the most conceptually elegant. He took the full spectrum of separated colors produced by the first prism, and instead of examining them individually, he recombined them, using a second prism, or in some versions of the experiment a converging lens, to bring the separated colored beams back together into a single beam. When he did this, the recombined light was white again. Not a new color, not some murky blend, but ordinary white sunlight, restored. The conclusion Newton drew from this was genuinely revolutionary, overturning centuries of assumption. White light, he argued, was not pure or simple at all. It was, in fact, a mixture, a composite of all the different colors of the spectrum blended together. The prism was not creating or adding color to the light passing through it. It was separating out colors that had been present in the white light all along, bending each color by a very slightly different amount as it passed through the glass, because, as Newton showed, each color of light was refracted, or bent, at its own characteristic angle. Red bent the least, violet bent the most, and every color in between had its own specific degree of bending. This was why the colors spread out into a band rather than remaining superimposed on one another. This discovery mattered enormously, and not simply as an interesting curiosity about prisms. It meant that color was not, as had long been assumed, some kind of modification imposed on light by the objects it passed through or reflected off of. Color was a fundamental, inherent property of light itself, and different colors were, in some sense, different kinds of light, mixed together in ordinary daylight, and separable through careful experimentation. It was a discovery made not through pure abstract reasoning, but through patient, deliberately designed experimental testing, isolating variables, testing predictions, and following the evidence, precisely the kind of rigorous experimental method that was, at the time, still a relatively new and contested approach to understanding nature. Newton would not publish these findings immediately. That story, and the controversy it eventually caused, belongs a little further along in his career. But the foundational experimental work, the darkened room, the narrow beam, the two prisms, took place substantially during this extraordinary stretch of forced isolation. There is one more piece of this period's mythology worth addressing directly and carefully, because it has become perhaps the single most famous story associated with Newton's entire life: the apple. The popular version of the story imagines Newton sitting beneath an apple tree at Woolsthorpe, watching an apple fall, and in that instant, suddenly grasping the complete theory of universal gravitation, as though the idea arrived essentially fully formed in a moment of dramatic epiphany. This vivid, cinematic version of events is almost certainly an oversimplification, and the complete theory of gravity that Newton eventually published took him roughly 20 more years of sustained mathematical work to fully develop and prove, not a single afternoon. However, the underlying story is not pure invention either, and this distinction matters. Newton himself, late in his life, told the story of an apple falling to several different people, including, according to a well-documented account, the antiquarian William Stukeley, who recorded a conversation with an elderly Newton in which Newton described sitting in a contemplative mood in the garden at Woolsthorpe and being prompted, by the sight of an apple falling from a tree, to wonder why the apple always fell straight down, perpendicular to the ground, rather than sideways or upward. From that seemingly simple question, Newton apparently began to wonder whether the same force pulling the apple toward the earth might extend much further than anyone had assumed, perhaps far enough to reach the moon, and whether that same force might be what kept the moon in its orbit rather than allowing it to drift away in a straight line into space. So the more accurate version of the story is not that an apple gave Newton the entire theory of gravity in an instant, complete with all its mathematics fully worked out. It is that a falling apple, at some point during this period of isolation at Woolsthorpe, prompted a genuinely important question, a question that planted a seed. Could gravity, the ordinary, familiar force that pulls objects down to the ground, be the very same force that governs the motion of the moon and, perhaps, the planets themselves? It was an audacious idea, because at the time, most natural philosophers still assumed, whether explicitly or simply by unquestioned habit, that the heavens operated according to entirely different rules than the earthly, terrestrial world below. Aristotle's ancient division between the imperfect world beneath the moon and the perfect, unchanging heavens above still lingered, even among those who had abandoned much of the rest of his physics. The notion that the same simple force responsible for a falling apple might also govern the sweeping orbit of the moon around the Earth was, in its way, a proposal to erase that ancient boundary altogether, to suggest that the heavens and the Earth followed the very same physical laws. Newton, during the plague years, began working with this idea mathematically, attempting some early calculations comparing the force needed to hold the moon in its orbital path with the force of gravity as measured here on Earth's surface. According to his own later account, these initial calculations came reasonably close to matching, lending some support to his idea, though not close enough, using the figures available to him at the time for the size of the Earth to feel fully confident or conclusive. It would be years before Newton returned to this problem with the mathematical tools and astronomical data needed to work it through properly and rigorously. For now, in the mid-1660s, it remained an intriguing and proven hypothesis, tucked away among many other lines of inquiry Newton was pursuing simultaneously, one thread among the mathematics, the optics, and the mechanics all developing at once in his restless, solitary mind. By 1667, the worst of the plague had passed, and Cambridge reopened its doors. Newton returned to Trinity College, and this time, his unusual talents began to be formally recognized. He was elected a Fellow of Trinity College in October of 1667, a position that provided him financial support, housing, and the freedom to pursue scholarly work in exchange for certain teaching and administrative duties. 2 years later, in 1669, an event occurred that dramatically accelerated Newton's rise within the university. Isaac Barrow, the Lucasian professor of mathematics who had recognized Newton's unusual ability during his student years, resigned his prestigious professorship, reportedly, at least in part, to recommend Newton as his successor. Whatever the precise circumstances of the transition, the outcome was remarkable. Newton, still in his mid-20s, was appointed to the Lucasian Chair of Mathematics at Cambridge, one of the most respected academic positions in England, a role that came with a salary, prestige, and, crucially, the freedom to pursue whatever line of mathematical and scientific research he found most compelling. Newton's early years as Lucasian professor were, by most accounts, spent in continued intense, largely private study. His lectures, which he was required to deliver, were reportedly not always well attended. His subject matter was often too advanced and too idiosyncratic for the ordinary undergraduate audience. But behind the scenes, away from the lecture hall, Newton continued the work he had begun during the plague years, refining his mathematical methods, deepening his experimental investigations into optics, and beginning to build the reputation, at least among a small circle of correspondents, of an unusually gifted and unusually reclusive natural philosopher. One practical problem occupied a significant portion of Newton's attention during these years, growing directly out of his optical experiments: the design of telescopes. Ordinary refracting telescopes of the period, which used curved glass lenses to gather and focus light, suffered from a persistent and frustrating flaw. Because, as Newton's own prism experiments had shown, different colors of light bend by different amounts when passing through glass. A simple lens does not focus all colors of light to precisely the same point. The result was a colored fringe or halo, usually a smear of reddish and bluish light, surrounding the edges of whatever the telescope was viewing, an effect now known as chromatic aberration. This blurring effect limited how much detail even the best refracting telescopes of the era could reveal, no matter how skillfully their lenses were ground. Newton, understanding the underlying cause of this problem better than perhaps anyone in Europe, thanks to his own detailed investigations into how light behaved when refracted through glass, proposed a different solution entirely. Rather than using a lens to gather and focus light, which would inevitably separate colors and cause blurring, he designed a telescope that used a curved mirror instead. A mirror, unlike a lens, reflects all colors of light equally and to the same focal point, without the color-splitting problem that plagued refracting designs. Around 1668, Newton constructed, largely with his own hands, a small working reflecting telescope, grinding and polishing the mirror himself, and casting the metal alloy used for it according to his own recipe, since suitable mirrors were not commercially available. The resulting instrument, though quite small, just a few inches in length, produced images that were reportedly sharper and clearer than those from much larger conventional refracting telescopes of the time, precisely because it avoided the chromatic distortion that had limited every telescope built before it. News of this remarkable little instrument eventually reached the Royal Society of London, the recently founded and increasingly influential organization of natural philosophers dedicated to the promotion of experimental science, whose members included many of the leading scientific minds in England. Newton, encouraged by colleagues at Cambridge, sent an improved version of his reflecting telescope to the Royal Society in London toward the end of 1671. The instrument caused a genuine sensation among the Society's members when they examined it and tested its capabilities. It was formally demonstrated, praised for its performance, and Newton, still a relatively unknown figure outside his immediate Cambridge circle, was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in January of 1672, largely on the strength of this single, ingenious piece of engineering. This election opened a new chapter in Newton's life, bringing him, for the first time, into direct correspondence and occasional conflict with the broader scientific community of England, rather than working in near total isolation as he largely had up to this point. And it was through this new connection to the Royal Society that Newton made the decision, at the encouragement of members eager to hear more from the inventor of such a remarkable telescope, to share something else entirely. His still unpublished findings on the nature of light and color, the results of those careful prism experiments conducted years earlier during his plague year isolation at Woolsthorpe. In February of 1672, Newton sent a paper to the Royal Society describing his theory that white light was a mixture of differently colored, differently refractive rays, the conclusions he had reached through his prism experiments years before. It was Newton's first major public scientific publication, and it should have been, by any reasonable expectation, a triumphant introduction of a brilliant young natural philosopher to the wider scientific world. Instead, it triggered controversy almost immediately and introduced Newton to a man whose name would become deeply, sometimes bitterly, entangled with his own for the rest of both their lives: Robert Hooke. Hooke was, by the early 1670s, already an established and highly regarded figure at the Royal Society, serving as its curator of experiments, responsible for designing and conducting demonstrations at the Society's meetings, and he had already published significant work of his own on light and color in his influential book Micrographia a few years earlier. When Newton's paper on light was read before the Royal Society, Hooke was asked to review and respond to it. His response was pointed and critical. Hooke did not simply raise questions or request clarification. He challenged the validity of Newton's central conclusions, defending his own earlier theoretical framework for understanding color, and suggesting that Newton's experimental results, while interesting, did not actually prove what Newton claimed they proved. Newton, who had spent years carefully, methodically working through these experiments, testing and retesting his conclusions with the rigor of someone who trusted mathematical and experimental precision over speculation, did not take this criticism well. This was, in many ways, the first real public test of an aspect of Newton's character that would define much of the rest of his career: an intense, almost visceral reaction to any challenge to his work, particularly from a rival he considered less rigorous than himself. Newton engaged in a lengthy, increasingly strained exchange of letters with Hooke and the Royal Society, defending his findings point by point. He felt, and would continue to feel for years afterward, that his careful experimental work had been dismissed too quickly by a man more interested in defending his own prior theories than in seriously engaging with new evidence. The dispute dragged on. through further letters and further published objections, not only from Hooke, but eventually from other continental natural philosophers as well, and it left Newton, by his own later account, deeply frustrated and disillusioned with the process of public scientific debate. At one point, exhausted by the ongoing controversy, Newton apparently considered withdrawing from the Royal Society and from public scientific life altogether, preferring the quiet, undisturbed solitude of his private study at Cambridge to the friction and public scrutiny that came with sharing his discoveries. He would, in fact, largely retreat from active public engagement with the Royal Society for a considerable stretch of years afterward, continuing his research privately, but increasingly reluctant to expose his work to public dispute before he considered it fully complete and defensible. This early conflict with Hooke, seemingly centered on a relatively narrow scientific disagreement about the nature of light, planted the seeds of a much deeper and more consequential rivalry, one that would resurface, years later, in connection with a far larger and more important question, the question of gravity itself and the mathematical laws governing the motion of the planets. For roughly a decade following the bruising dispute over his theory of light, Newton largely withdrew into private research at Cambridge, pursuing an extraordinarily wide range of interests with the same intense, solitary focus that had characterized his work since his student years. He continued refining his mathematical methods. He conducted extensive experiments in chemistry and alchemy, filling notebook after notebook with observations, procedures, and theoretical speculation, a substantial body of work that would remain largely hidden from public view for centuries, but which occupied an enormous amount of his time and intellectual energy during this period. He also devoted considerable private study to theology and biblical chronology, developing unorthodox religious views that, had they become widely known at the time, would have posed serious problems for a man holding a position at an officially Anglican university. These aspects of Newton's life, the alchemy, the unconventional theology, the almost obsessive secrecy surrounding both, form a significant part of his story, but they belong more properly to the later chapters of his life, after the events we are building toward now. Because throughout this period of apparent withdrawal from public scientific life, Newton had never actually abandoned the question that had first occurred to him, in some early form, back during the plague years at Woolsthorpe, the question of what force governs the motion of the moon, and whether that force might be the very same gravity that pulls objects down to the surface of the Earth. He continued to think about it, on and off, over the years, without any pressing reason to resolve it publicly or urgently. That would soon change. In 1679, Robert Hooke, now serving as Secretary of the Royal Society, wrote to Newton in an attempt to reopen scientific correspondence between them, following years of coolness after the earlier dispute over light. In the course of this renewed exchange, Hooke raised a question about the paths that objects would follow under the influence of a force that pulled them toward a central point, with the strength of that force decreasing according to a specific mathematical relationship as distance increased. This was, whether either man fully appreciated it at the time, a direct approach to precisely the problem of planetary motion and gravity, expressed in a specific technical form, an inverse square relationship, meaning that the force weakens in proportion to the square of the distance from the central point, so that doubling the distance reduces the force to a quarter of its original strength. Tripling the distance reduces it to a ninth, and so on. The exact details of this exchange, and precisely how much credit Hooke deserves for suggesting the inverse square idea to Newton, would later become a matter of significant and bitter dispute between the two men, a dispute that would only intensify in the years ahead. What is clear from the surviving correspondence is that this exchange with Hooke reignited Newton's interest in the mathematics of orbital motion, prompting him to return, with renewed focus, to calculations he had first sketched out, in a much rougher form, more than a decade earlier during his plague year isolation. Newton worked on these calculations privately, in his usual solitary manner, over the following years, without any public announcement, refining his understanding of how an inverse square force would shape the orbit of a planet moving around the sun, or a moon moving around a planet. It was demanding, intricate mathematical work, requiring him to draw on the very calculus methods he had developed years earlier but had never formally published, and it represented a substantial advance beyond anything he had managed during his initial youthful speculations at Woolsthorpe. Then, in August of 1684, an unexpected visitor arrived at Cambridge, and his arrival would set in motion the creation of what many historians consider the single most important scientific book ever written. The visitor was Edmund Halley, a brilliant young astronomer, already known for his own careful observations of comets and stars, and a member of the Royal Society who moved in the same intellectual circles as both Newton and Hooke. Halley had, in fact, recently been part of a conversation in London with Hooke and another prominent natural philosopher, Christopher Wren, better known today as the architect who would go on to design St. Paul's Cathedral, but at the time also a respected scientist and mathematician in his own right. During that conversation, the three men had discussed the very same problem. What shape of orbit would result from a force pulling toward a central body, weakening according to an inverse square relationship? Hooke apparently claimed he had already solved the problem but declined, for reasons of his own, to share the solution, prompting Wren to offer a prize to whichever of them could actually produce the mathematical proof. Neither Hooke nor Wren nor Halley himself could work it out satisfactorily. Frustrated by this impasse, Halley decided to travel to Cambridge and pose the question directly to Newton, whose mathematical abilities were, by this point, becoming known, at least among a certain circle, as exceptional. According to the account later given by Newton's friend and first biographer, Abraham de Moivre, who recorded a conversation he had with Newton about this very episode, Halley asked Newton what curve a planet would trace out if it were attracted to the sun by a force that weakened with the square of the distance. Newton reportedly answered immediately, without hesitation, that the resulting orbit would be an ellipse, precisely matching the shape Kepler had already determined decades earlier through careful observation of planetary motion, though without any theoretical explanation for why the orbits should take that particular shape. Halley, astonished, asked Newton how he knew this with such certainty. Newton apparently replied that he had already calculated it. Halley then asked to see the calculation. Newton searched among his papers but, according to this account, could not immediately locate it, and promised to work it out again and send it to Halley later. This episode, whether every detail of it is preserved with perfect accuracy or not, marks a genuinely pivotal turning point. It was Halley's visit and his insistent, encouraging follow-up in the months afterward that persuaded Newton to formally write up his findings on orbital motion and gravity rather than leaving them, as he had left so much of his mathematical work over the years scattered across private notebooks that only he would ever read. Newton sent Halley a short paper a few months later, reworking his earlier calculations into a more rigorous form, demonstrating mathematically why an inverse square force would indeed produce elliptical orbits, matching Kepler's observations. Halley recognized immediately that this short paper represented something of enormous importance, and he urged Newton to expand it into a fuller, more comprehensive treatment. What followed was one of the most intense and sustained periods of concentrated intellectual work in Newton's entire life. Over roughly the next 2.5 years, working with an obsessive focus that reportedly left him neglecting food, sleep, and virtually every other concern, Newton expanded that initial short paper into a vast, systematic treatise covering the mathematical laws of motion and the theory of universal gravitation in extraordinary depth and detail. Colleagues and household members who observed him during this period described a man almost entirely consumed by the work, sometimes forgetting to eat meals that had been prepared for him, emerging from his rooms at Trinity looking disheveled and distracted, his mind clearly still working through the mathematics even when his body was elsewhere. The resulting book, written in Latin, the scholarly language of the period, was titled Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, meaning the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, and it would become known simply as the Principia. Within its pages, Newton laid out, with rigorous mathematical proof, a framework that would govern the physical sciences for more than 2 centuries afterward. The book opened with 3 fundamental laws of motion, each deceptively simple to state, yet together powerful enough to describe the movement of virtually anything, from a thrown stone to a orbiting planet. The first law stated that an object at rest will remain at rest, and an object in motion will continue moving in a straight line at a constant speed, unless acted upon by some outside force, a principle building on and formalizing ideas about inertia that Galileo and others had begun to explore decades earlier. The second law established a precise mathematical relationship between force, mass, and acceleration, essentially explaining exactly how much an object's motion would change in response to a given force, depending on how much matter that object contained. The third law, perhaps the most famous, stated that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, meaning that whenever one object exerts a force on another, the second object exerts an equal force back on the first. From these foundations, Newton built toward his crowning achievement, the law of universal gravitation. He demonstrated, with mathematical rigor that left little room for reasonable dispute, that every object with mass attracts every other object with mass, with a force that grows stronger as the masses involved increase, and weaker as the distance between them increases, weakening specifically according to that same inverse square relationship that had occupied his attention since his exchange with Hooke years earlier. And crucially, Newton showed that this was not merely a rule describing some objects or some kinds of motion. It applied universally to falling apples and to orbiting moons, to comets sweeping through the solar system and to the tides rising and falling in Earth's oceans, all of it governed by the very same simple mathematical law. This was the answer to the question that had first occurred to Newton in some early, unformed way, more than 20 years earlier, watching an apple fall in the garden at Woolsthorpe. The force pulling the apple to the ground and the force holding the moon in its orbit were, indeed, one and the same force, gravity, operating according to a single universal mathematical law that applied equally throughout the heavens and across the surface of the earth. The ancient boundary that Aristotle had drawn between the changeable world below the moon and the eternal, perfect heavens above had not merely been challenged, as Galileo and Copernicus had challenged it. It had been mathematically dissolved. Bringing the Principia into print, however, proved to be its own considerable ordeal. The Royal Society, which had initially agreed to fund the book's publication, found itself short of money at the time, having recently spent its publication budget on an ambitious and ultimately commercially disappointing book about the history of fish. Edmund Halley, who had first prompted Newton to write the work and had continued pushing him to finish it, now stepped in once again, this time taking on much of the financial risk and practical burden of seeing the book through to publication himself. Personally covering printing costs and meticulously managing correspondence with the printer to ensure the complex mathematical diagrams and notation were reproduced accurately. The process was complicated further by a fresh dispute with Robert Hooke, who, upon learning the contents of the forthcoming book, claimed that he deserved to be credited as a co-discoverer of the inverse square law of gravitation, based on his earlier correspondence with Newton years before. Newton reacted to this claim with real fury. He was, by this point in the writing process, deep into the third and final section of the Principia, and upon hearing of Hooke's demand for credit, he reportedly threatened to withdraw that final section from publication entirely rather than share credit he did not believe was warranted. Halley, who had to manage this delicate situation while also trying to get the book successfully into print, worked to smooth things over as best he could, and Newton was eventually persuaded to complete and publish the full work, though he did make a point, within the book's own text, of acknowledging Hooke's earlier suggestion regarding the inverse square relationship, albeit in fairly measured, minimal terms, alongside acknowledgments of other earlier astronomers whose observations had informed the work. The underlying resentment between the two men, however, was not resolved. It would linger for the rest of Hooke's life. The Principia was finally published in the summer of 1687. It was not, by any means, an easy book to read. Written in dense mathematical Latin, employing rigorous geometric proofs throughout rather than the more familiar algebraic notation that would become standard in later scientific writing, it was accessible, in its full technical detail, to only a small number of the most mathematically sophisticated readers in Europe. Even some capable natural philosophers of the period struggled to follow its arguments in complete detail. But its significance was recognized immediately by those capable of grasping it, and its influence spread rapidly even among those who could not follow every proof. because its central conclusions could be understood and appreciated even by readers who could not verify every step of the mathematics behind them. What Newton had achieved, in that single dense volume, was nothing less than a unified mathematical description of the physical universe. Falling objects on Earth, the orbits of the planets around the Sun, the motion of the Moon around the Earth, the paths of comets streaking through the solar system, the rise and fall of ocean tides, all of it, Newton demonstrated, could be explained and precisely predicted using the same handful of fundamental laws, the three laws of motion and the single universal law of gravitation. It was an extraordinary act of intellectual synthesis, drawing together threads that reached back through Galileo's studies of falling bodies, Kepler's laws of planetary motion, Copernicus's sun-centered universe, and Descartes' vision of a mechanical natural world, and weaving them into a single coherent mathematical structure with a predictive power no previous system of natural philosophy had ever achieved. It would be a mistake, and Newton himself would likely have objected to the characterization, to say that he single-handedly invented modern science, as though the achievement sprang from nowhere, owing nothing to those who came before him. Newton stood, quite consciously, on a foundation built by others, by Copernicus, who first dared to move the Earth from the center of the universe, by Kepler, whose painstaking calculations revealed the true elliptical shape of planetary orbits, by Galileo, whose telescope shattered the old assumption of perfect, unchanging heavens, and whose careful experiments began the work of mathematically describing motion here on Earth, by Descartes, whose vision of a universe governed by mechanical laws, however flawed in its specific details, helped set the stage for exactly the kind of systematic, law-governed universe Newton would go on to describe with such precision. And yes, even by Robert Hooke, whatever the bitterness that would remain between the two men, for the questions his correspondence had helped provoke. Newton later wrote, in a now famous phrase, of having seen further by standing on the shoulders of giants, a sentiment that, whatever complicated personal history lay behind it, captured something true about how his achievement had come about. But what Newton had done with that inherited foundation was still something genuinely without precedent. He had taken scattered observations, competing theories, and partial mathematical descriptions, accumulated across more than a century of astronomical and physical investigation, and forged them into a single, rigorous, mathematically unified system, one capable not merely of describing what had already been observed, but of predicting, with striking accuracy, motions and phenomena that had not yet been directly measured at all. The universe, Newton had shown, was not governed by a patchwork of separate rules for the heavens and the earth, for the largest planets and the smallest falling stones. It operated according to a small number of universal mathematical laws, the very same laws, everywhere, for everything. Word of the Principia's achievement spread quickly through the learned circles of Europe. Within England, Newton's reputation, which had already been building steadily since his election to the Royal Society and his work on light and telescopes, now transformed into something considerably larger. He was, almost overnight, among those capable of appreciating the book's significance, recognized as the preeminent natural philosopher in the country, and increasingly, across the continent as well, despite lingering skepticism from some. Prominent thinkers on the European mainland who remained loyal to alternative physical systems, particularly the mechanical philosophy associated with Descartes, and who would continue to debate and resist aspects of Newton's gravitational theory for years to come. For Newton himself, the publication of the Principia marked the end of one extraordinary chapter of his life, and, though he could not have fully known it at the time, the beginning of another, quite different one. The intensely private, often reclusive scholar who had spent decades largely alone in his rooms at Trinity College, consumed by mathematics, optics, and the mysteries of celestial motion, working through problems that few around him could even follow, let alone appreciate, had produced a book that would establish him as one of the greatest scientific minds in human history. He was now a figure of genuine public significance, courted by the intellectual and political elite, and increasingly drawn, whether he fully welcomed it or not, out of the quiet isolation of Cambridge and toward a much more public stage. But the story of Isaac Newton does not end here, at the moment of his greatest scientific triumph. The man who had unified the heavens and the earth through mathematics was, in many ways, still the same guarded, obsessive, and quietly resentful figure shaped by that fatherless birth at Woolsthorpe, that abandonment by his mother, that solitary childhood spent building windmills and sundials while other boys played. In the years ahead, that same intensity, the very quality that had allowed him to work for years in isolation on problems no one else could solve, would draw him into far darker and more consuming conflicts. A bitter, decades-long dispute with the German philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Leibniz over who truly deserved credit for inventing calculus. A lifetime of secret experimentation in the forbidden art of alchemy, conducted in private and hidden from public view, increasingly. Unorthodox and dangerous religious beliefs, carefully concealed from a world that might have destroyed his career and reputation had they become widely known. And, in a turn that few who knew him as a withdrawn Cambridge scholar could have predicted, an entirely new career as a powerful government official, hunting down counterfeiters in the dangerous streets of London with the same obsessive, unrelenting focus he had once directed at prisms and planetary orbits. The scientific revolution, it would turn out, was only one part of the extraordinary story of Isaac Newton. The rest of it, stranger, more secretive, and in many ways more human, was still to come. Isaac Newton had done something no one else in human history had ever done. He had taken the fall of an apple and the orbit of the moon and shown, with mathematical certainty, that they obeyed the very same law. The heavens and the earth, divided for 2,000 years by ancient philosophy, had been joined by a single equation. And yet, in the years that followed the publication of that achievement, the greatest conflicts of Newton's life were not written in the language of mathematics at all. They were written in letters full of accusation, in secret laboratory notebooks hidden from view, in theological manuscripts he dared not publish, and eventually in the interrogation rooms of London prisons, where a former Cambridge professor would spend his evenings chasing counterfeiters through the underworld of a city he had once had no interest in visiting at all. When the Principia appeared in the summer of 1687, it did not conquer the intellectual world overnight. Among the small circle of mathematicians and astronomers capable of following its dense geometric proofs, the reaction was closer to astonishment than immediate universal agreement. The book demonstrated, with a rigor no one could easily dismiss, that a single force, acting according to a single mathematical rule, could account for the orbits of planets, the paths of comets, the behavior of the tides, and the fall of ordinary objects on Earth's surface. This alone secured Newton's reputation among the leading natural philosophers of England almost immediately. His fellow members of the Royal Society recognized that something extraordinary had been accomplished, even those who could not follow every step of the geometry. But acceptance across the rest of Europe came far more slowly, and for a very specific reason. Newton's theory of universal gravitation required that two objects could exert a pull on one another across empty space, with nothing physically connecting them, no medium transmitting the force, no mechanism explaining how it traveled from one body to another. To many educated readers on the European continent, and even to a good number in England, this looked less like an explanation and more like a mystery disguised as mathematics. It sounded, to ears trained in the mechanical philosophy that had dominated European thought for much of the century, uncomfortably close to the occult forces and hidden sympathies that natural philosophers had spent decades trying to banish from serious scientific explanation. The dominant rival framework at the time came from René Descartes, whose vision of the universe filled all of space with an invisible fluid substance, and explained planetary motion through great swirling vortices of this fluid, physically carrying the planets around the sun the way water might carry a leaf around a whirlpool. Whatever its shortcomings, and there were many, Cartesian vortex theory had one significant advantage over Newton's gravitation in the eyes of many continental thinkers. It offered a physical mechanism. It did not require one to accept that objects could simply reach across the emptiness of space and pull on each other without any intervening cause. Prominent continental philosophers, including the influential Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, whose own story becomes centrally important later in this account, continued for years to favor some version of a mechanical, contact-based explanation of planetary motion over Newton's action at a distance, regarding Newton's gravity as, in essence, an unexplained mystery rather than a genuine solution. Newton was aware of this objection, and it is worth noting that he himself expressed some discomfort with it. In private correspondence, he acknowledged that the idea of one body acting upon another across empty space, without any medium or mechanism, seemed philosophically troubling, and he was careful, in his own writing, not to claim he had explained what gravity fundamentally was. He had shown, with overwhelming mathematical precision, how gravity behaved, and how its behavior explained an enormous range of observed phenomena. What gravity actually was, at the deepest physical level, why masses attracted one another at all, Newton declined to speculate about with any confidence, famously writing that he framed no hypotheses on the matter. This distinction, between describing how a force operates mathematically and explaining what ultimately causes it, would remain a subject of philosophical debate for generations, and in truth, one could argue physics has never fully closed that question even today. It would take several decades, and the work of later scientists who extended, tested, and confirmed Newtonian predictions with ever greater precision, before gravitational theory based on Newton's laws became the settled, dominant framework across Europe. Voltaire, the French writer and philosopher, would later play a significant role in popularizing Newton's ideas on the continent, partly through his own writings following a period spent in England, helping to shift French intellectual opinion gradually away from Cartesian vortices and toward Newtonian gravitation. But that shift took time, and it did not happen automatically simply because the mathematics in the Principia was correct. Scientific revolutions, however brilliant their foundations, still have to be fought for, explained, defended, and gradually absorbed into the wider intellectual culture, and Newton's revolution was no exception. Meanwhile, within England itself, an older and more personal conflict was hardening into something that would never fully heal. Robert Hooke was not a man who deserved to be remembered as a minor footnote in someone else's story, and it does Newton's whole tale a disservice to treat him as such. By the 1680s, Hooke had already built one of the most impressive and wide-ranging scientific careers of the age. He had served for years as the Royal Society's curator of experiments, responsible for designing and conducting the demonstrations that formed the core of the Society's weekly meetings, a role that required extraordinary breadth of practical and theoretical knowledge. He had made significant contributions to the study of elasticity, formulating what is still known today as Hooke's law, describing the relationship between the force applied to a spring and the distance it stretches. He had built and improved microscopes, and his lavishly illustrated book Micrographia, published years earlier, had introduced readers to a hidden world of magnified insects, plant structures, and the cellular architecture of cork, work that remains a landmark in the history of microscopy. He had contributed to astronomy, to the study of combustion, to architecture, helping to rebuild London after the Great Fire of 1666 alongside Christopher Wren, and yes, to early thinking about gravity and planetary motion as well. It was this last area, gravity, where Hooke's grievance against Newton became most pointed. Hooke had, in correspondence with Newton back in 1679, raised the idea that a force pulling a planet toward the sun, weakening according to an inverse square relationship with distance, might explain planetary orbits, a genuinely important insight, whatever its precise origin. When the Principia appeared years later, containing a rigorous mathematical proof that an inverse square force did indeed produce the elliptical orbits Kepler had observed, Hooke felt strongly that his own earlier contribution had been minimized, and he said so, publicly and repeatedly, complaining that Newton had built his masterpiece on a foundation Hooke himself had helped lay, without giving him proper credit. Newton's response to this complaint reveals a great deal about his character. He did not respond with generosity or diplomatic acknowledgement. He responded with fury. From Newton's perspective, Hooke had not actually solved anything. Hooke had proposed an idea, a reasonable guess about the shape of the force involved, but he had never produced the mathematical proof demonstrating that such a force would actually produce the elliptical orbits observed in nature. That proof, the rigorous demonstration that transformed a plausible guess into an established, mathematically certain law, was Newton's own achievement, built through years of difficult calculation that Hooke, by Newton's account, was simply not capable of performing. In Newton's view, suggesting an idea was not the same as proving it, and credit belonged to whoever did the difficult work of actually establishing the truth, not to whoever happened to speculate about it first. There is real substance to Newton's position here. Mathematical proof and physical demonstration were, in the culture of 17th century natural philosophy, taken extremely seriously as the dividing line between speculation and genuine knowledge, and Hooke's own scientific output, however broad and inventive, was sometimes criticized by contemporaries for offering clever suggestions without always following through with the rigorous demonstration needed to confirm them. But there is also real substance to Hooke's grievance. Ideas do not emerge from nowhere, and correspondence between the two men shows that Hooke's letter had, at minimum, prompted Newton to return to a problem he had left dormant for years, reigniting an investigation that would eventually produce the Principia's crowning achievement. Whether that constitutes a debt worth formally acknowledging, or merely the ordinary, untraceable way that ideas circulate and build upon each other within any scientific community, remains a matter reasonable historians continue to discuss. What is not in doubt is how deeply this dispute affected Newton personally, and how long its effects lasted. He never forgave what he regarded as Hooke's presumption in claiming credit for work Newton considered entirely his own. The two men's relationship, already strained by their earlier clash over the nature of light back in the 1670s, deteriorated further and never recovered. And there is a detail from later in this story, disputed in its precise interpretation but widely noted by historians, that speaks to just how deep this resentment ran. After Hooke's death in 1703, Newton was elected president of the Royal Society, a position he would hold for the rest of his life. Around this time, a portrait of Hooke, the only known painted portrait of him, disappeared from the Royal Society's collection and has never been recovered. No historian can prove with certainty what happened to it, and it would be irresponsible to claim definitively that Newton was responsible for its disappearance. But the timing, occurring as it did during a period when Newton held enormous influence over the Society's affairs and its physical premises, has fueled speculation for centuries, and it illustrates, at minimum, just how thoroughly the bitterness between these two brilliant men had come to color the historical memory of their relationship. To understand why disputes like this mattered so intensely in Newton's era, it helps to understand the culture of scientific priority in the 17th century more broadly. There was, at this time, no formal, universally agreed system for establishing who had discovered what and when. Scientific journals were a relatively new invention, still finding their footing. Ideas circulated through private letters, through conversations at coffee houses and society meetings, through manuscripts passed hand to hand among trusted correspondents, sometimes for years before appearing in print, if they appeared in print at all. In such an environment, questions of priority, of who had truly discovered something first, could be genuinely difficult to settle, and the stakes were high, because a natural philosopher's entire reputation, and often his livelihood and social standing, could rest on being recognized as the true author of an important discovery. Newton, throughout his life, took these questions of priority with an intensity that went well beyond ordinary professional concern. He guarded his intellectual property, so to speak, with something closer to a sense of personal honor under siege, and anyone who seemed to threaten his claim to a discovery could expect a response of real ferocity. This brings us to Newton's personality more broadly, because the Hooke dispute was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout his life, and understanding it helps explain much of what follows. Those who knew Newton personally, and the documentary record left behind in letters, memoirs, and the accounts of contemporaries, paints a consistent picture of a man of extraordinary, almost frightening powers of concentration, paired with a deep discomfort around exposing his work to public scrutiny before he considered it complete, and an intense, sometimes disproportionate reaction to any challenge or criticism once his work finally was made public. Colleagues at Cambridge described him as absent-minded about ordinary daily life, capable of forgetting meals entirely while absorbed in a mathematical problem, sometimes emerging from his rooms having apparently not slept properly for days. He kept few close friends. He never married, and while historians have speculated about various aspects of his personal and emotional life, The honest answer is that the surviving evidence tells us relatively little with certainty about his inner emotional world, beyond what can be inferred from his documented behavior and his own occasional writings. What is clear is that Newton found genuine collaboration difficult. He preferred, throughout most of his career, to work through problems entirely alone, sharing his conclusions only when he judged them fully proven, and often reacting badly when others, working with less complete information, offered criticism or alternative interpretations along the way. This tendency had already appeared early in his career, during the dispute over his theory of light in the 1670s, when Hooke's critical response to Newton's paper on color left Newton so frustrated that he seriously considered withdrawing from the Royal Society altogether rather than continue defending his work in public debate. It appeared again, more intensely, in the dispute over gravity and the Principia, and it would appear once more, in its most bitter and consequential form, in the controversy that came to dominate a significant portion of Newton's later life. His dispute with the German philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz over the invention of calculus. Leibniz was, by any reasonable measure, one of the towering intellects of his age, a figure whose range of accomplishment rivaled Newton's own, though in a very different style. Born in Leipzig, Leibniz was a philosopher, a diplomat, a historian, and a mathematician, a man who moved through the courts and academies of continental Europe with a cosmopolitan ease that the reclusive Newton never sought and likely never could have managed. Among his many intellectual projects, Leibniz developed, independently, his own version of the mathematical methods for handling continuously changing quantities, the very subject Newton had worked on privately, under the name of flux science, during his own plague year isolation at Woolsthorpe decades earlier. The timing of these two men's mathematical development is at the very heart of the controversy, and it deserves to be laid out carefully, because the truth is considerably more nuanced than the simple story sometimes told. Newton had developed his method of flux science, in substantial form, during the mid-1660s, years before Leibniz began his own mathematical investigations into the subject. This much is well established through Newton's surviving private notebooks and manuscripts, many of which historians have been able to date with reasonable confidence. However, and this is crucial, Newton did not publish this work at the time. He shared some of it privately, in letters and manuscripts circulated among a small circle of English mathematicians and correspondents, and he alluded to his methods in later published works without laying out the full system in detail. But a complete, public presentation of his calculus methods did not appear in print until many years later, well after Leibniz had already published his own version. Leibniz, working independently in the 1670s, developed his own system for handling these same kinds of mathematical problems, involving rates of change in areas under curves, and he did so using a different notation and, in certain respects, a somewhat different conceptual approach than Newton's. Crucially, Leibniz published his findings in a series of papers beginning in the mid-1680s, making his methods available to the broader mathematical community well before Newton had done the same with his own earlier work. For a period of some years, this dual development proceeded without major public conflict. There was, in fact, a documented visit by Leibniz to London in 1673, during which he had some limited contact with English mathematicians and scientific circles, and later correspondence between Leibniz and Newton, conducted respectfully through intermediaries, in which each shared some information about his mathematical progress, though the precise extent of what Leibniz may have learned from these exchanges versus what he developed through his own independent insight remains a genuinely disputed question among historians of mathematics to this day. For a while, in fact, the mathematical community in Europe seemed content to regard the two systems as parallel, independent achievements, a not uncommon occurrence in the history of science, where similar conditions and shared background knowledge sometimes lead different thinkers towards similar discoveries around the same time, without either having stolen from the other. But this fragile peace did not hold. As Leibniz's notation and methods spread through continental Europe, gaining influential followers among younger mathematicians, and as Newton's own reputation grew following the triumph of the Principia, supporters on both sides began to raise questions of priority, at first indirectly, through pointed remarks in published works and private correspondence, and eventually through direct, explicit accusations. The dispute escalated dramatically in the early years of the 18th century. Members of Newton's circle, and eventually Newton himself, began suggesting openly that Leibniz had not developed his calculus independently at all, but had instead derived it, whether through the limited correspondence the two men had shared or through information passed along by mutual contacts from Newton's own earlier, unpublished work. Leibniz, understandably furious at what he considered an attack on both his originality and his personal integrity, defended himself vigorously, insisting that his methods had been developed entirely through his own reasoning, arrived at independently and by a somewhat different conceptual route than Newton's. The controversy reached its most institutionally significant point in 1712, when the Royal Society, at the request of Leibniz himself, who hoped for what he believed would be an impartial investigation into the matter, agreed to establish a committee to examine the priority dispute and issue a formal report. What followed was, in retrospect, a rather remarkable episode in the history of scientific institutions, because the investigation was anything but impartial. By this point, Newton was president of the Royal Society, wielding enormous influence over its affairs. Historians have subsequently established, through examination of the Society's surviving papers, that Newton played a direct, substantial role in shaping the committee's investigation and its conclusions, and that he was, in fact, the anonymous author of significant portions of the report the committee ultimately issued under the Royal Society's institutional authority. Unsurprisingly, given who had effectively written it, the report concluded firmly in Newton's favor, declaring that Newton was the first inventor of calculus and implying, though not stating with complete bluntness, that Leibniz's claim to independent discovery was suspect. Leibniz never accepted this verdict, and given what later historical investigation revealed about Newton's hidden hand in producing it, it is easy to understand why. The dispute continued, growing increasingly bitter and personal, playing out through further published pamphlets, further accusations, and a hardening of national rivalry, with English mathematicians largely rallying behind Newton's priority claim and continental mathematicians largely defending Leibniz, a division that had real, lasting consequences for the development of mathematics itself. Because Leibniz's notation, the familiar symbols still used in calculus classrooms today, proved in many respects more flexible and easier to work with than Newton's own notation for flux science. Continental mathematicians who followed Leibniz's system made more rapid progress in extending and applying calculus during the decades following the dispute, while British mathematicians, working within a scientific culture that had, in effect, been instructed by Newton's authority to reject Leibniz's approach as derivative or illegitimate, fell behind for a considerable period, clinging to Newton's more cumbersome notation partly out of national and institutional loyalty. The dispute was never fully resolved during either man's lifetime. Leibniz died in 1716, still defending his claim to independent discovery, and by most accounts, Newton continued expressing hostility toward Leibniz's memory even after his death. What does modern historical scholarship conclude, now that both men and the controversies surrounding them belong entirely to history rather than to living rivalry? The general consensus among historians of mathematics today is that both men developed calculus independently, arriving at closely related mathematical insights through somewhat different routes and somewhat different notational systems, at roughly overlapping periods, though with Newton's private development preceding Leibniz's by several years, even as Leibniz's publication preceded Newton's by a considerable margin. It was, in other words, one of history's genuine cases of simultaneous, independent discovery, the kind of episode that occurs more often in the history of science than popular storytelling usually acknowledges, arising naturally when multiple brilliant minds, working within a shared intellectual environment, approach the same set of unsolved problems using many of the same available tools and predecessor ideas. The tragedy is not that one man stole from the other. The tragedy is that neither man, nor the scientific institutions surrounding them, proved capable of accepting that uncomfortable, more complicated truth, and the resulting dispute consumed years of energy, damaged Newton's own historical reputation once the extent of his manipulation of the Royal Society's supposedly independent investigation became known, and left a lasting unnecessary rift between English and continental mathematics. The calculus dispute reveals, with unusual clarity, a Newton quite different from the patient, methodical natural philosopher who had spent years quietly verifying his theory of light through careful, repeated experimentation. This was a Newton willing to use institutional power, secrecy, and considerable personal influence to defend his own priority and reputation, a Newton for whom being right on the mathematics was not, in the end, sufficient. He needed to be seen to be right, publicly, decisively, and permanently. And this brings us to another, entirely different side of Newton's character, one that remained almost completely hidden from public view during his lifetime, and one that would astonish later generations when its full extent was finally uncovered. For most of his adult life, running in parallel with his groundbreaking work in mathematics, optics, and physics, Newton was also a dedicated, tireless practitioner of alchemy. This fact sits uneasily with the popular image of Newton as the founder of rational, mathematical, modern physics, and for a long time after his death, this side of his intellectual life was minimized, downplayed, or simply left out of popular accounts altogether, treated as an embarrassing footnote unworthy of serious attention. It was only in the 20th century, when a substantial collection of Newton's private papers, long held privately by descendants and eventually auctioned off in 1936, came into the hands of scholars willing to take them seriously, that the true scale of Newton's alchemical work became clear. The economist John Maynard Keynes, who purchased a significant portion of these papers at that auction and studied them closely, famously remarked, in a lecture prepared for the tercentenary of Newton's birth, that Newton was not the first of the age of reason, but rather the last of the magicians, a description that, however provocative, captured something genuinely important about the private Newton these manuscripts revealed. The scale of this hidden work is difficult to overstate. Newton produced well over 1 million words of alchemical writings and notes across his lifetime, an output that rivals or even exceeds the volume of his more famous scientific work. He maintained a private laboratory, first at Cambridge and later at his home in London, where he conducted extensive practical experiments, working with furnaces, crucibles, and a wide range of metals and chemical substances, sometimes, according to later accounts from those who knew him, working through the night tending fires that had to be kept burning continuously for days or weeks at a time in pursuit of particular alchemical transformations. He studied an enormous body of alchemical literature, much of it written in the deliberately obscure, symbolic, coded language traditional to the discipline, in which practitioners disguise their actual methods and materials behind layers of mythological and allegorical imagery, precisely to prevent the uninitiated from stumbling upon powerful secrets. Newton copied out, translated, cross-referenced, and annotated countless such texts, attempting, with the same painstaking, systematic rigor he brought to his mathematical work, to decode what he believed might be genuine hidden knowledge buried within this obscure symbolic tradition. Among the central goals of alchemical practice, as understood in Newton's time, was the pursuit of what practitioners called the philosopher's stone, a substance believed capable of transmuting base metals into gold, and, in some traditions, capable of extending human life or curing disease. Newton took this pursuit seriously, conducting repeated experiments involving mercury and various metallic compounds, testing and recording results with careful attention, much as he had once tested and recorded the behavior of light passing through his prisms. He was fascinated, in particular, by mercury, a substance whose strange liquid metallic properties made it central to much of the alchemical tradition, and his surviving notebooks record countless experiments involving its combination with other metals in pursuit of transformations that, from the standpoint of modern chemistry, we now understand to be impossible. It would be a serious mistake, however, to conclude from any of this that Newton was simply being foolish, or that his alchemical pursuits represented some kind of embarrassing lapse from an otherwise rational scientific mind. The boundaries between what we now separately categorize as chemistry, alchemy, medicine, and natural philosophy simply did not exist in the same way during Newton's lifetime. Alchemy, in the 17th century, was a serious intellectual tradition practiced by many respected natural philosophers, and it involved genuine, careful, systematic experimentation with real chemical substances and processes, even if it was framed within a theoretical and symbolic tradition that later chemistry would eventually abandon. Some historians have argued, in fact, that Newton's alchemical experimentation, with its close attention to careful measurement, controlled conditions, and reproducible results, actually helped sharpen the experimental habits he brought to his more famous scientific work, rather than existing as some entirely separate, irrational pursuit disconnected from his rigorous scientific method. There is also a deeper, more philosophical thread connecting Newton's alchemy to his physics, one worth pausing on. Newton's gravitational theory required accepting that forces could act invisibly, at a distance, without any obvious physical mechanism connecting cause and effect, an idea that, as we discussed earlier, made many of his contemporaries deeply uncomfortable. Some historians have suggested that Newton's willingness to entertain such an idea, an invisible force reaching across empty space, may have been made easier by his deep immersion in alchemical thought, a tradition that had long spoken of hidden, active principles operating within and between substances in ways not always visible or mechanically obvious. Whether or not this connection can be proven with certainty, it is a reminder that Newton did not experience his own intellectual life as neatly divided into separate boxes labeled science, alchemy, and religion, the way modern categories might encourage us to imagine. For Newton, the universe was one vast, unified mystery, and he pursued its secrets wherever the evidence, or the promise of hidden ancient wisdom, seemed to lead. Why, then, did Newton keep this enormous body of alchemical work so carefully hidden from public view during his lifetime, sharing it with almost no one, and ensuring that it remained locked away, unpublished, among his private papers? Part of the answer lies in the uncertain and somewhat precarious reputation alchemy held even within Newton's own time. While serious natural philosophers did practice it, alchemy also existed under a persistent cloud of suspicion, associated in the popular imagination with charlatans, con artists, and fraudulent claims of turning lead into gold, a practice that, in England, had actually been legally restricted for a period under earlier statutes concerned with the potential for alchemical fraud to destabilize the currency, restrictions that had been relaxed by Newton's time, but that reflected the lingering official wariness surrounding the practice. A man of Newton's growing public stature, holding an important academic position and increasingly prominent within England's most respected scientific institution, had real reason to worry that open, enthusiastic association with alchemical pursuits, particularly the more mystical, transmutation-focused aspects of the tradition, might undermine the credibility of his more mathematically rigorous scientific work, inviting ridicule or skepticism from critics eager to find any excuse to dismiss him. There was also, quite simply, the matter of Newton's characteristic secrecy, the same instinct that had made him reluctant to publish his mathematical work on flux science for years, and that had made him hesitant to expose his theory of light to public scrutiny before he considered every possible objection addressed. Newton guarded his unfinished work jealously throughout his life, whatever the subject, preferring to work in private until he felt fully confident in his conclusions, a habit that, in the case of his alchemy, meant a lifetime of investigation that was never, by his own judgment, complete enough to share, and that consequently remained locked away until long after his death, waiting for a very different age to finally take it seriously. Newton's private intellectual world extended into yet another area that he kept carefully guarded from public view throughout his life: religion, and specifically, a set of theological convictions that, had they become widely known during his lifetime, could have seriously damaged his career and his standing within English society. Newton was, by all evidence, a man of profound and genuine religious conviction, though not in the conventional form his official position might have suggested. He devoted an enormous amount of time and intellectual energy to the study of Scripture, of biblical prophecy, and of the early history of the Christian Church, producing extensive private manuscripts on these subjects that, much like his alchemical writings, rivaled his scientific output in sheer volume. He was fascinated by biblical chronology, attempting, with the same systematic, painstaking method he applied to mathematics and physics, to work out precise dates for historical events described or implied within Scripture and other ancient sources, cross-referencing astronomical calculations, records of ancient kingdoms, and historical texts in an effort to construct an accurate timeline of ancient history stretching back to the earliest periods described in the Bible. But Newton's deep study of Scripture and early church history led him, over time, to a conclusion that placed him well outside the boundaries of acceptable religious belief in 17th and early 18th century England. Through his own careful reading of early Christian texts and church history, Newton came to reject the doctrine of the Trinity, the orthodox Christian teaching that God exists as three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, united in a single divine being. Newton concluded, based on his own theological and historical research, that this doctrine had not been part of original, authentic Christianity, but had instead been introduced later through what he regarded as a corruption of the true early Christian faith, formalized particularly through 4th-century church councils that he believed had distorted the original, simpler understanding of Christ's relationship to God. This position, generally described by historians as a form of anti-Trinitarianism, placed Newton in a genuinely dangerous position, at least in a legal and professional sense, had it become widely known. England at the time maintained laws restricting the public expression of such views, and Newton held a fellowship at Trinity College, Cambridge, an institution that, as its very name suggests, required its fellows to affirm orthodox Trinitarian doctrine as a condition of their position. Newton, faced with a requirement to take holy orders as an ordained Anglican clergyman in order to retain his fellowship, a standard expectation for Cambridge fellows at the time, found himself in a genuine crisis of conscience, unwilling to formally affirm a doctrine he privately believed to be a corruption of true Christianity, yet unwilling to give up the position and resources that allowed him to continue his scientific and scholarly work. The resolution to this dilemma came through a special dispensation, granted in 1675, that exempted the holder of the Lucasian chair of mathematics, the very professorship Newton held, from the requirement to take holy orders, likely secured through the intervention of Isaac Barrow, Newton's former mentor and the professorship's previous holder, though the full details of exactly how this arrangement came about remain somewhat unclear in the surviving historical record. Whatever the precise mechanism, the dispensation allowed Newton to retain his position without publicly declaring beliefs he privately rejected, and it allowed him to continue his unconventional theological research entirely in private, sharing his conclusions only with a small, trusted circle of like-minded correspondents, and ensuring that the bulk of his religious writings remained unpublished during his lifetime, much like his alchemical manuscripts, waiting for a later age willing to examine them without the risk of professional or legal consequence. Newton's investigations into ancient chronology and religious history connected, in his own mind, to an even broader intellectual project, a belief that humanity had once possessed a body of true, unified knowledge about God and the natural world, a knowledge he believed had existed among the earliest civilizations, and that had subsequently been lost, fragmented, or deliberately obscured over the centuries through historical corruption, both religious and philosophical. Newton devoted substantial private study to the history and chronology of ancient kingdoms, to the architecture and proportions of the Temple of Solomon, which he believed might encode meaningful ancient knowledge, and to the broader project of reconstructing an accurate ancient historical timeline that could help recover fragments of this original, purer understanding. This may seem, to a modern audience accustomed to sharply dividing science from religion and ancient mysticism, like a strange and inconsistent set of interests for the man who gave the world the mathematically rigorous Principia. But for Newton himself, there was no such division. He appears to have understood his scientific work, his alchemical research, and his theological and historical investigations as different facets of a single overarching project. The recovery, through careful, disciplined inquiry, of true knowledge about a universe he believed had been designed and ordered by a rational, active God. The mathematical laws governing planetary motion were, in Newton's own understanding, not evidence against the existence of a divine creator, but rather evidence of one, a demonstration of the extraordinary rational order God had built into the fabric of creation. Science and theology, for Newton, were not competing explanations of the world. They were two different roads toward the same ultimate truth. By the 1690s, however, Newton's life was approaching a dramatic and largely unexpected turn, one that would pull him permanently away from the quiet, secluded world of Cambridge scholarship and thrust him into the practical, often dangerous business of public administration. England's currency, by the middle of the 17th century, was in serious trouble. The coins in circulation, hammered by hand using methods that had changed little for centuries, were irregular in shape and thickness, making them relatively easy to tamper with. A widespread practice known as clipping had become a severe and growing problem. Individuals would shave small slivers of precious metal from the edges of silver coins, gradually accumulating valuable metal while passing the clipped coins back into circulation at their original face value, gradually reducing the actual silver content of England's money supply and undermining public confidence in the currency's value. Counterfeiting, the production of entirely fraudulent coins, compounded the problem further, flooding the economy with debased currency and threatening the financial stability of the nation at a time when England was engaged in expensive, ongoing military conflicts that depended heavily on a stable, trustworthy monetary system. In response to this escalating crisis, the English government undertook a major currency reform in the mid-1690s, known as the Great Recoinage, an enormous undertaking involving the withdrawal of the old, damaged coinage and the production of a new, more uniform currency, produced using improved milling techniques that made coins far more difficult to clip or counterfeit successfully. Overseeing this vast and complicated project required administrative talent of a very particular kind. Meticulous, rigorous, capable of managing enormous logistical complexity, and, crucially, resistant to the kind of corruption that had plagued previous administrations of the mint. Newton's friend and former student Charles Montague, who had risen to a position of significant political influence as Chancellor of the Exchequer, recommended Newton for a position at the Royal Mint. And in 1696, Newton was appointed Warden of the Mint, a role that many at the time assumed would be a comfortable, largely ceremonial position, a reward for his scientific achievements rather than a demanding practical office. Newton, characteristically, treated it as nothing of the sort. He approached the administration of England's currency with precisely the same obsessive, methodical intensity he had once brought to prisms, planetary orbits, and alchemical furnaces. He threw himself into the technical and logistical challenges of the recoinage, personally studying the mechanical processes of coin production, working to improve efficiency and accuracy, and taking a hands-on role in a project that many of his social peers would have considered beneath the dignity of a famous natural philosopher. The recoinage, though difficult and initially disruptive to the economy, was ultimately judged a substantial success, restoring public confidence in England's currency and stabilizing a financial system that had been under serious strain. But it was in a different aspect of the mint's responsibilities that Newton's particular talents found their most surprising and dramatic expression: the pursuit and prosecution of counterfeiters. As Warden of the Mint, Newton held responsibility not only for producing sound currency, but for investigating and prosecuting those who undermined it through counterfeiting and coin clipping, offenses that, remarkably by modern standards, were classified in English law of the period as high treason, carrying the penalty of death, since counterfeiting the king's currency was considered an offense against the sovereign's own authority. Most of Newton's predecessors in this role had approached this enforcement duty with limited enthusiasm, delegating the difficult, often dangerous work of gathering evidence and pursuing suspects to subordinates while focusing their own attention on the mint's more comfortable administrative functions. Newton did the opposite. He immersed himself personally in the investigative work, adopting disguises to move undetected through London's taverns and prisons, gathering intelligence from informants, conducting what amounted to criminal interrogations himself, and building detailed evidentiary cases against suspected counterfeiters with the same systematic thoroughness he had once applied to tracking rays of light through a prism. Over the following years, he was personally responsible for investigating and securing convictions against a substantial number of counterfeiters, working through London's genuinely dangerous criminal underworld, an environment about as far removed from the quiet libraries of Trinity College as could be imagined, and one that carried real personal risk. since the individuals he pursued had every incentive to intimidate, bribe, or otherwise silence anyone building a case against them. Among all of the counterfeiters Newton pursued during his years at the Mint, none has captured the attention of historians quite as thoroughly as William Chaloner, a genuinely remarkable criminal figure whose extended contest with Newton reads, even stripped of any invented embellishment, like something from a work of fiction. Chaloner was a man of considerable, if entirely dishonest, talent and audacity. Having built a reputation as a skilled counterfeiter, producing fraudulent coins of unusually high quality, he had also developed a parallel and remarkably brazen strategy, presenting himself, at various points, as a public-spirited critic of the very counterfeiting problem he was secretly contributing to, offering himself to government officials as an expert consultant capable of helping identify weaknesses in the Mint's coin production methods and suggesting improvements to prevent counterfeiting, all while continuing his own illicit operations largely undetected. Chaloner went so far as to publicly accuse the Mint itself of incompetence and corruption, at one point appearing before a parliamentary committee to argue that Mint officials were themselves involved in producing debased or counterfeit coinage, accusations that directly implicated the institution Newton now oversaw and, by extension, threatened Newton's own professional reputation. Newton, unsurprisingly, did not take kindly to being publicly accused of incompetence by a man he increasingly suspected of being one of the very criminals undermining England's currency. He began building a case against Chaloner with characteristic thoroughness, gathering witnesses, cultivating informants within the criminal underworld who could testify to Chaloner's activities, and slowly assembling the evidence needed to secure a conviction against a man who had, until then, proven remarkably adept at escaping serious legal consequence, in part through his own cunning and in part through his willingness to inform on and betray his own criminal associates whenever it served his interests. The pursuit was neither quick nor easy. Chaloner used every resource available to him to escape prosecution, including attempting to discredit witnesses, seeking to have legal proceedings against him dismissed on technical grounds, and even petitioning influential figures for intervention on his behalf. But Newton's patience and methodical persistence, the very qualities that had once allowed him to work through years of difficult mathematical calculation without losing focus, proved more than a match for Chaloner's cunning. Newton continued gathering evidence and coordinating with legal authorities across multiple attempts, and in 1699, William Chaloner was finally convicted of high treason for counterfeiting. He was executed shortly afterward at Tyburn, London's traditional site for public executions, bringing to a close one of the most colorful and thoroughly documented criminal investigations of Newton's entire career. It is worth pausing to appreciate just how strange this turn in Newton's life truly was. The same man who had spent his 20s largely alone in a Cambridge study, working through calculations concerning the orbits of planets, was now, in his 50s, personally interrogating suspects in London prisons and building criminal cases against forgers and counterfeiters, pursuing justice with an intensity that startled even his contemporaries. It was not a role Newton had sought out of any particular passion for law enforcement. It had come to him almost by circumstance, through his appointment to the Mint. But once given the responsibility, Newton, true to the pattern that defined every phase of his life, could not simply perform the role adequately. He had to master it completely. Newton's success at the Mint, both in the technical achievement of the recoinage and in his relentless prosecution of counterfeiters, cemented his standing as a figure of genuine practical importance, not merely a brilliant but impractical scholar. In 1699, he was promoted from warden to master of the Mint, a more senior and lucrative position that he would hold for the remainder of his life, and one that made him, by the standards of the time, a genuinely wealthy man. A striking contrast to the modest farming family he had been born into at Woolsthorpe more than half a century earlier. By this point in his life, the transformation from the isolated young scholar of the 1660s to the powerful public figure of the early 1700s was essentially complete. In 1703, following Robert Hooke's death, Newton was elected president of the Royal Society, a position he would hold continuously until his own death nearly a quarter century later, wielding enormous influence over the direction of English science, the careers of younger natural philosophers, and the institutional culture of the society itself. In 1705, Queen Anne conferred a knighthood upon him, making him Sir Isaac Newton, an honor granted, notably, for his public service at the mint and his standing as a leading figure of the realm, rather than specifically for his scientific achievements, though the two were, by this point, thoroughly intertwined in the public's understanding of who Newton was. As president of the Royal Society, Newton continued to exercise the same combination of rigor and controlling intensity that had characterized his earlier career, now backed by considerably greater institutional authority. He took an active role in shaping the Society's activities and publications, and he continued to involve himself, often decisively, in ongoing scientific disputes, including, as we have already seen, his significant behind-the-scenes influence over the Royal Society's official investigation into the calculus priority dispute with Leibniz, where the younger Newton had, sometimes withdrawn from public controversy, retreating into private study rather than continue an exhausting public dispute. The older, more powerful Newton increasingly used the institutional levers now available to him to ensure that disputes were settled, whenever possible, in his own favor. As Newton entered old age, remarkably, his intellectual restlessness never truly subsided. He continued revising and refining his major scientific works throughout his later years, overseeing new editions of the Principia and of his other major published work on optics, incorporating updates, responding to criticisms, and continuing to think carefully about problems in mathematics and natural philosophy well into his 70s. He continued, in private, his lifelong work on biblical chronology and theology, producing manuscripts on these subjects that would remain unpublished until long after his death. He lived, during these later decades, in considerable comfort in London, maintaining a household that included his niece, Catherine Barton, who managed much of his domestic affairs and who was herself a woman of considerable wit and social skill, while connected within London's political and social circles, providing Newton, in his final years, with a household companionship he had rarely allowed himself during his younger, more solitary decades at Cambridge. His health, unsurprisingly for a man of his advanced age in the 18th century, gradually declined during his final years, and he suffered periodically from various ailments common to old age at the time. He remained, however, intellectually engaged and publicly active for most of this period, continuing to preside over Royal Society meetings and to maintain correspondence on scientific matters into his 80s, a genuinely long life by the standards of his era. Isaac Newton died on the 20th of March, 1727, at his home in London, at the age of 84. His death was met with the kind of public recognition rarely extended, at that time, to a scholar or scientist. He was given a state funeral and buried in Westminster Abbey, the resting place traditionally reserved for English monarchs, statesmen, and figures of the very highest national significance. His pallbearers included prominent members of the nobility and government, and his funeral procession and monument reflected the reality that Newton had become, by the time of his death, not merely a respected scholar, but something closer to a national institution, a symbol of English intellectual achievement recognized across Europe. A large and elaborate monument was later erected at his burial site within the abbey, depicting Newton reclining above symbolic representations of his scientific achievements, an honor that placed the fatherless boy born in a small Lincolnshire farmhouse among the most celebrated figures in English history. Stepping back from the funeral procession and the marble monument, it is worth considering, honestly and without excessive sentiment, what kind of man had actually lived this extraordinary life. He was, unquestionably, one of the most powerful scientific minds in human history, a man capable of sustained, solitary concentration on the most difficult mathematical and physical problems of his age, and capable, more than perhaps any single individual before him, of drawing together scattered threads of earlier discovery into a unified, mathematically rigorous understanding of the physical universe. But he was also secretive, often to the point of genuine paranoia about protecting his priority and reputation. He was capable of sustained, sometimes ruthless personal animosity toward those he perceived as rivals, whether Robert Hooke, whose portrait vanished under circumstances that remained suspicious, or Gottfried Leibniz, whose reputation Newton worked, quietly and through institutional manipulation, to undermine even after Leibniz's death. He spent, by some measures, more of his intellectual life immersed in alchemy and unorthodox theology than in the mathematical physics for which he is now most remembered, pursuits he kept carefully hidden from a public that would likely have found them scandalous or professionally damaging had they been widely known during his lifetime. And in a turn few who knew him as a young Cambridge scholar could have anticipated, he spent a substantial portion of his later career not in a laboratory or a library at all, but investigating and prosecuting criminals in the dangerous streets and prisons of London. These were not separate, contradictory versions of Newton existing independently of one another. They were facets of a single, remarkably consistent personality, intensely curious, almost incapable of leaving a difficult problem unsolved. Once it had captured his attention, deeply private about work he considered unfinished, and fiercely, sometimes disproportionately protective of his own reputation and priority once his conclusions were finally revealed to the world. The same obsessive, unrelenting focus that allowed him to spend years quietly working through the mathematics of planetary orbits also drove him to spend years quietly working through obscure alchemical texts, to spend years secretly reconstructing ancient biblical chronology, and to spend years patiently building a criminal case against a single, elusive counterfeiter. It was, in every domain he touched, the very same mind at work. What, then, did this singular, contradictory man actually leave behind? His scientific legacy is difficult to overstate. The three laws of motion and the law of universal gravitation, laid out in the Principia, provided the physical sciences with a framework so powerful, so successful at describing and predicting the behavior of the physical world, that it would remain the dominant paradigm in physics for more than 2 centuries, and it remains, even today, remarkably accurate and useful for describing the vast majority of physical phenomena encountered in ordinary experience and in most engineering applications. His work in optics, demonstrating that white light is a composite of differently colored, differently refractive rays, fundamentally reshaped the scientific understanding of light and color, and his invention of the reflecting telescope solved a genuine practical problem that had limited astronomical observation for decades, a design still used, in more advanced modern forms, in many of the world's most powerful telescopes today. His independent development of calculus, whatever the bitterness of the dispute with Leibniz over its origins, provided mathematics and physics with an essential tool, one still fundamental to nearly every field of science and engineering practice today. But Newton's single greatest contribution was arguably not any one of these individual achievements, remarkable as each was on its own. It was the underlying idea that unified them. The recognition that the same mathematical laws governing the fall of an apple in an English orchard also govern the motion of the moon around the Earth, the orbits of the planets around the sun, and the paths of comets streaking through the solar system. Before Newton, the heavens and the earth had been understood, by nearly every serious thinker stretching back to antiquity, as fundamentally different domains, governed by entirely different rules. Newton showed, with mathematical certainty that could be tested and verified, that this ancient division was false. There was only one universe, governed everywhere by the same handful of simple, elegant mathematical laws. This was the true scale of what came to be known as the Newtonian Revolution, and it remains, arguably, the single most consequential unification in the entire history of science. It would be a mistake, however, and one Newton himself, at his most reflective, might well have cautioned against, to treat his physics as the final, unchangeable word on the workings of the universe. 2 centuries after Newton's death, Albert Einstein's theories of relativity revealed that Newtonian gravity, however extraordinarily successful, was itself an approximation, remarkably accurate under most ordinary conditions, but incomplete when applied to extremely strong gravitational fields or to objects moving at speeds approaching that of light. Phenomena entirely outside anything Newton could have observed or tested with the instruments available to him. Around the same period, the development of quantum mechanics revealed an entirely different and deeply strange set of rules governing the behavior of matter and energy at the smallest scales, rules that bear little resemblance to the smooth, predictable, clockwork universe that Newtonian mechanics had described. None of this diminishes Newton's achievement. It simply reflects the nature of scientific knowledge itself, which does not arrive in a single, final revelation, but builds, generation after generation, upon the foundations laid by those who came before, each new framework refining, extending, or in some cases substantially revising what earlier thinkers had established, much as Newton himself had built upon Kepler, Galileo, Copernicus, and Descartes. Newtonian mechanics remains, to this day, extraordinarily useful, accurately describing the motion of nearly everything humans encounter in ordinary life, from a thrown ball to an orbiting satellite, and it will likely remain useful for as long as human beings continue building bridges, launching rockets, and studying the motion of the physical world around them. In the years and decades following his death, Newton's reputation only continued to grow, evolving gradually from that of a respected, if formidable, English natural philosopher into something closer to a cultural symbol of scientific genius itself, a figure invoked across Europe and eventually across the world as the embodiment of what rational, disciplined human inquiry could achieve when applied with sufficient rigor and persistence. Generations of later scientists would build directly upon his mathematical framework, testing, extending, and confirming his predictions with ever greater precision, and Newton's name became, in the centuries that followed, something close to a shorthand for the entire achievement of the scientific revolution. But the popular image that survived him, the story of a man sitting beneath a tree, struck by sudden inspiration when an apple happened to fall, understood everything about gravity in a single flash of insight, was always a considerable simplification, more comforting in its simplicity than the far stranger, more difficult reality. The actual Newton spent years, not moments, wrestling with the mathematics of motion and gravitation, working through failed calculations, revising and refining his understanding across decades, before finally producing the rigorous proof that would transform a childhood question into a mathematically certain law. The actual Newton also spent years hunched over alchemical furnaces, searching obscure symbolic texts for hidden ancient truths. He spent years secretly reconstructing biblical chronology and quietly rejecting the religious orthodoxy of the very institution that employed him. He spent years pursuing counterfeiters through the dangerous streets of London with the same unrelenting patience he had once applied to planetary orbits. And he spent years locked in bitter, sometimes underhanded disputes with brilliant rivals, unable, for all his genius, to simply share credit graciously or let old grievances rest. If we return, finally, to that fragile, premature infant born in the winter of 1642 at Woolsthorpe Manor, a child not expected to survive his first night, fatherless before his birth, and soon abandoned by his mother to the care of a grandmother in a quiet Lincolnshire farmhouse, it becomes difficult not to see a certain continuity running through the entire span of the extraordinary life that followed. The solitary boy who built windmills with mice inside them and lost track of grazing cattle while absorbed in a book grew into the solitary young scholar who taught himself the mathematics of an entire continent while his official tutors assigned him Aristotle. The scholar who spent 2 isolated years during a plague epidemic quietly transforming mathematics, optics, and his own understanding of motion grew into the mature natural philosopher who spent decades more, often working entirely alone, transforming those private insights into a published, mathematically rigorous vision of the universe. And the man who achieved that transformation carried with him, throughout every subsequent triumph and every subsequent conflict, the same restless, obsessive, guarded intensity that had first been shaped, however precisely we choose to understand it, in that lonely childhood at Woolsthorpe. Isaac Newton's greatness did not come from being a flawless or uncomplicated man, a tidy hero fit for a simplified legend. It came from the sheer scale of his curiosity and from a determination that rarely, if ever, allowed him to set aside a difficult question once it had genuinely captured his attention. Whether that question concerned the color of sunlight, the orbit of the moon, the hidden meaning of an alchemical text, the true chronology of ancient kingdoms, or the identity of a counterfeiter hiding somewhere within the crowded streets of London. The universe he spent his life trying to understand was larger and stranger than any single theory could ever fully capture. And Newton himself, when we look honestly at the entire span of his life rather than the simplified legend that followed him, proves to have been larger, stranger, and considerably more contradictory than the falling apple ever suggested.